What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Friday, August 23rd edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have a massive 14-game MLB slate today, so really no shortage of ways that you can approach it. As always, we're going to take a look at how I would be approaching it if the slate started right now. But ownership on these 14-game slates generally going to be pretty flat, especially for offenses. So the raw ownership is just going to be a little bit less of a concern than it is on your smaller slates. Negatively correlating against pitchers still can work well, especially if they are particularly popular, but the opportunity cost for doing so is higher than on your small slates also. So it becomes a little bit more just kind of play whatever you want, kind of, for a lack of a better way of putting it. I will also say that my exposures for this show are not exactly how I would like them to be on a 14-game slate. I'm a lot more concentrated than I typically would be. I do think there's a decent chance that I end up being less concentrated by lock than I am for this show. When I looked at some of the simulated ROIs, or a lot of the ROIs for the lineups that I could play, they just came in at a really, really unrealistically high level, which usually means that there's something in the ownership projections that are wrong, or I screwed up somewhere in like creating the fields that I simulated against. I couldn't figure out what it was. So maybe it's just that the ownership is just going to be higher on the guys that I'm getting to, but I do think my exposures will probably end up changing at least a little bit, just because this is not usually what it ends up looking like for me when I have a 14-game slate. But we can still get into everything, talk about what looks good and what doesn't. No weather concerns today, so fortunately we don't have that to worry about. That's pretty nice. So going to go position by position as I normally do on this show, and stack by stack. If you have questions about teams I'm not getting to, if there's a reason why or anything like that, go ahead and ask. If I have a specific reason I don't like something, I'll let you know. Especially on a 14-game slate, it's probably just going to be I have a limited number of lineups and that team or player isn't in it. But if there is anything specific that stands out, happy to talk about that. As always, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you get alerts when the shows go live. Also, check out the links in the description below. Endgame Syndicate, Brick 75's Draft Caddy, and my MLB Dub Club, all linked in there if you're looking to join any of those. I'll talk about those a little bit more later as well. But starting with the pitching here, getting to an absurd amount of Carlos Rodon. And this is one where this to me isn't as alarming as the exposures I'm getting to some bats and some stacks in particular on this slate. I normally don't get 95% of a pitcher on a 14-game slate either, but if I am going to get 95% of a pitcher, I am perfectly fine taking the one facing the Colorado Rockies. This is an unbelievably bad offense, incredibly low implied run total, and not only are they bad at hitting, as far as production goes, they do strike out a good amount as well. Their active roster has the highest strikeout percentage in baseball against left-handed pitching since the start of last season at 28.3%. Oakland comes in at second at 26%. So pretty big gap there. 82 WRC plus for those Rockies hitters. So this isn't even one of those teams where, they're not good at hitting, but they also don't strike out, or they strike out a lot, but they can actually hit like the A's. This is as good a matchup as you can get. So again, 95% is aggressive. It's a lot. There are plenty of other pitching options on the slate, but Rodon's 25.8% K percentage is one of the better strikeout percentages on this slate. The matchup is as good as it gets. If I do end up just getting him in essentially every lineup, I think that's perfectly fine. Stephen Leibowitz mentioned the Rodon K line is 8.5. I bet that over today as well. That was a bet that I put out there for the Endgame Syndicate members and my Dub Club members. I don't remember off the top of my head what the line was. I do know it was plus money. I think it was like plus 125 on DraftKings maybe, and then like 114 on Caesars. It was somewhere in that range, like 116. He does project under 8.5 strikeouts, but at plus money, I took that bet. Like, this is as good a spot as you're going to get. Rodon isn't Cy Young level Carlos Rodon anymore, but does still have pretty good strikeout stuff, and the matchup's great. Luis Castillo showing up a lot for me as well, pitching in Seattle, so really, really good park to pitch in. Pretty good matchup against the Giants. $9,800 price tag is pretty expensive, but again, just one of the better pitchers on this slate. 24.5% K percentage, 3.7 to 3.8 xFIP for him this year. We do not have a Giants lineup yet. They probably will have a pretty balanced lineup. You do prefer right-handed heavy lineups against Castillo, so that is a slight negative, but the park's really good. The Giants do strike out. Castillo, of course, is a good pitcher overall. So still happy to get to him. And then Chris Sale also showing up a lot. So like I said, much more concentrated on 3 pitchers than I typically am on a slate of this size. But also those 3 pitchers are Carlos Rodon against the Rockies, Luis Castillo, and Chris Sale. So I'm not going to be too upset about it. But if you wanted to tell me that you were playing just flatter exposures, that would be perfectly fine. And like I said, there is a decent chance that ends up being the case for me as well. Maybe the 43 or so % projected ownership on Rodon ends up being low. That's something that could happen, or the 20% on Castillo is low. So maybe those ownership projections come up. Maybe I end up adjusting them a little bit once I look a little bit closer. But clearly these are guys that you're going to be happy getting to. Beyond them, the field's getting to Hayden Birdsong a bit. I do like him as a value play at 6,600. He isn't somebody that I really needed in these lineups, but one reason for that is because of how much I'm getting to Detroit and Chicago offensively. So that does go hand in hand, where I already said that I don't really love how concentrated I am on a couple of stacks. Those stacks happen to be very, very cheap. So it kind of just makes me not need Hayden Birdsong. But if in lineups where I'm not going to cheap stacks, he does make sense here. Does have a good strikeout matchup against Seattle. He is pitching in a very, very good park, both for preventing runs and for getting strikeouts. So the field's at 12%, and I think that is perfectly fine at that cheap salary. Chris Bassett, pretty good matchup against the Angels. This is a team that does not hit right-handed pitching well at all. Bassett is a very middle-of-the-road pitcher. He doesn't really do a whole lot particularly well. He is better against righties than lefties, but overall 22% strikeout percentage, 4.26 xFIP this season. But the Angels active roster ranks in the top 10 in K percentage. They have an 87 WRC plus. Bassett is perfectly fine if you're getting there. I just don't have quite as much because he's getting squeezed by Rodon, Castillo, and Sale. Tanner Bybee, tough matchup for him at 9,200 against Texas. He's getting 11% ownership. He is a good pitcher. There's no real question about that. 26.9% K percentage is higher than Rodon. It is higher than Castillo. 3.6 xFIP is good as well. The Rangers are a more difficult team to strike out than the Giants or the Rockies. They rank 25th in K percentage against right-handed pitching. They do have a 95 below average WRC plus, but I think the matchup is probably why I'm getting so much more Castillo than Bybee, even though Castillo is getting a little bit more ownership. But if you wanted to just go to Bybee for the talent and the fact that he's relatively low owned at 11 or 12%, there's nothing wrong with that. He is a good pitcher. Good strikeout matchup for Bobby Miller. Not a great strikeout matchup for Joe Musgrove, but decent price tag on him. Other pitchers that the field's getting to, and I'm not. Nobody else above 10%. Savali right around 10%. Good matchup, reasonable price tag. Not a great pitcher, but again, the A's just strike out a lot, so he's somebody that I would probably be getting a bit more of if I weren't just jamming these 3. So like I was saying, not only is it that I'm getting to Sale, Rodon, and Castillo, which I'm perfectly happy with, but it is also probably a function of the offenses I'm getting to. As I were to get to more expensive offenses, I probably start getting to more Savali or Birdsong, and that's perfectly fine. So a lot of your pitcher exposure is just also going to have to do with what offenses you're getting to. Now, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but looking at the stacks, Detroit showing up a ton for me. I usually just don't get any stacks this often on a 14-game slate because, and the reason is just that even if they are the most likely stack to succeed, and I'm not saying that Detroit is, obviously the value part plays a really big role here. But even if they are, it's always a low percentage, where a team, I don't have the actual number in front of me, but, let's say the team with the highest chance of being the best stack tonight is like 10%. They're still failing 90% of the time. So this does go back to the conversation, the topic on the show the other day, talking about your approach, whether you're going to play more balanced or look to exploit the field more. I did run this set of lineups looking to exploit the field more. I thought that it would make for a better show and be interesting to look at, because if I knew if I ran balanced on a 14-game slate, it would probably just be a lot of I'm playing 6% of everybody except for a couple of guys. So That's one reason that you're seeing it pop like this, but normally it still doesn't to this extreme because any team is just still so likely to fail when there are 27 other teams that they're competing against. And so the same thing here, where you're seeing 37% of my lineups having 5-man Detroit stacks, 20 having 5-man White Sox stacks, and then just very small amounts of pretty much everything else. Ideally, I would end up with this cut back at least somewhat. Like, I can take a pretty big Detroit stand. I can take a pretty big White Sox stand if I want to and still not be getting as much as I am. So that is something that I think is likely to come down for me. But still, I do think that they look good here. There's not that's not the issue. It's just an issue of my lineups are starting to overlap a lot, and I am just putting a lot of eggs in one or kind of two baskets here. But it does look like a good spot for the Tigers. They are cheap. It looks like an okay spot for the White Sox, who are cheap as well. Montero is not bad. They're not terrible for the Tigers, but he's not great either. Chris Flexen, obviously not very good for the White Sox. So I don't mind getting either of those offenses. It is a park upgrade for Detroit as well. Just not, I don't think I need to at these levels. But it is also being driven in part by the pitching I'm getting to, just like the pitching is being driven by the ownership. Everything goes hand in hand. So it's not even completely clear if it's that I think Detroit is going really underowned or if I think the top pitching is going really underowned. It could just be that Sale's a huge priority, or Sale, Castillo, and whoever else, Rodon, are such big priorities that it's just saying, keep playing Detroit, keep playing the White Sox, keep playing these cheap stacks. Or it could be that the White Sox and Tigers look like such a big priority that it's just saying, keep playing Sale and Castillo. But either way, it is something that I want to look different by lock, but I think it is still suggesting the Tigers and White Sox look very good here. Toronto and Boston showing up next. 17% overall stack exposure to Toronto, 13% to Boston. Clearly two offenses that I don't have any issue whatsoever getting to. The Blue Jays are at home, which is nice, going up against the Angels. They clearly have a lot of power in their lineup. You have Jack Kokonowitz on the mound for the Angels. He is very bad, does not have good strikeout stuff, does not project to be very good in the major leagues. So I do like the matchup there, especially at home for Toronto. Boston, obviously a high upside offense. They are somewhere. They're at home in Fenway against Arizona. Decent matchup for them. Ryan Nelson, not the worst pitcher as far as limiting power. Doesn't give up a ton, or doesn't get a ton of strikeouts. 4.13 xFIP, 19.5% K percentage. I think if you go to the Red Sox, you are pretty much just betting on their talent level, which is perfectly fine in that park. Getting to some Tampa, New York, Dodgers, KC, pretty much spread out across a lot of other offenses other than the ones that I'm really jamming in here at the top, which I do like to see. Again, I just would like to see these numbers come down a little bit at least. Catching up on chat before I get to going through individual hitters and positions. If you like full stacking Colorado in large field tournaments, there is obviously merit to that because Rodon's going to be 40 to 50% owned. The reason that it's just a lot less appealing to do on a slate of this size as opposed to your smaller ones is that the window is a lot bigger for Rodon to like not be good and not be a play that you want, but for Colorado to still be irrelevant. If there were, 10, 12, 14 offenses total on this slate, then that window is smaller because if you say that Carlos Rodon in this really good strikeout matchup doesn't have a good DFS game, the chances are pretty high that the Rockies gave you a good outcome for DFS. When they have 27 other teams they're competing with, let's say they score 6 runs against Carlos Rodon and none of them are home runs, but they're all earned runs and they don't strike out a ton. Carlos Rodon ends up not having a good game and the Rockies are essentially completely useless because several of the other 27 teams are going to score. They're going to hit home runs. They're going to score more than 6 runs. So just the slate size makes that sort of negative correlation not meaningless, not like a bad idea necessarily, but just harder to execute, less likely that you have the winning offense, even if they do a good job of getting to Carlos Rodon. So that's kind of the problem there on a slate of this size. Stephen Leibowitz said that the odds on Rodon have moved, I think, in my favor since this morning. Optimal Prime said Washington, not a crazy strikeout team. Yeah, they're a tough team to strike out. Really annoying team to take pitchers against. Obviously, when you're talking about Chris Sale, like I don't mind. I'm still going to get to him. I was getting to about 34%. He has the highest K percentage on the slate by a wide margin at 33.5%. But yeah, the Nats are a difficult team to strike out. They rank 27th on their active roster in K percentage against left-handed pitching this year. They do only have a 91 WRC plus. This is a team that used to have Lane Thomas and doesn't. Not that that's included in the numbers I just mentioned because it is looking at their active roster, but one way or the other, it is a tough strikeout matchup. They certainly could make life difficult for Sale, but it is also one of the best pitchers in baseball so far this season. Einsteinium said, with the expensive pitching options getting the majority of the ownership, do you see any merit to playing more expensive stacks and paying down at pitching? I think that you can. For me, obviously, like that's not the approach that I'm taking, at least right now. But I would have no issue if you said, I think that there are reasonable value plays, and I think that going to them and getting better hitters is reasonable. Like I would have no issue if you said you just want to play more Birdsong. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble saying that freaking name. More Birdsong at 6,600 and get better hitters. That's fine. One thing though on larger slates too that I do think causes me to prioritize more expensive pitching, or realistically just get to the best projected pitching, which is obviously usually going to be the more expensive, is that it's two things. One, ownership is going to be more flat on offenses. So you don't run into the issue as much where everybody's playing like the same value stack with Sale plus Castillo, and it can be difficult to differentiate your lineups. You're going to have just so many different value stacks that you can go to with those pitchers. And then the second part of that same point, essentially, is that because there are so many different offenses that you can play the best pitchers with, there's just a pretty high chance that some, at least one or two of those cheap offenses come through. And once that happens, if you paid down for pitching and went to expensive offenses, you're kind of just fighting an uphill battle, because then you need those cheap guys like Birdsong to actually score a similar amount of raw points to those more expensive pitchers. Because of the way that fantasy points are distributed in MLB DFS, you're just pretty much always going to get like a bigger value multiplier on bats than you are on pitchers. So approaching it, not saying that you were, but like when you think through it, you could go to somebody like Birdsong, and if he scores 22 DraftKings points or 24 DraftKings points, he like 3 to 4x his salary. You're obviously not expecting 3 to 4x from a near 10K pitcher. But the problem is that assuming at least one or two of these cheap offenses do really well and probably put up a similar amount of fantasy points to the more expensive stacks, if Birdsong scored 22 and Sale scores 28, in a lot of cases, you could make the same lineup with Sale as Birdsong, more or less. And so those raw points at pitcher actually matter. So that's another reason why I do generally tend to just get to the best projected pitchers on slates of this size. Jake said he doesn't see any reason to pay up for pitching at all. I think I just explained a lot of it without even getting into the fact that Carlos Rodon is facing the Rockies, for example. So moving on to pitcher, Ryan Stubbs said, how's the FanDuel pitcher distribution? I don't know. I haven't run anything for FanDuel. DraftKings only show just because it would take twice the prep time and twice as much show time to do both shows. And obviously, one of the biggest differences on FanDuel is going to be how you approach the pitching, because of only having the roster one in addition to different pricing, both for hitters and for pitching. So I'm not even going to speculate on what I'd be doing with FanDuel pitching. It's obviously a very good matchup for Rodon on FanDuel too. Castillo is still a good pitcher on FanDuel. Sale's still a good pitcher. I'm very comfortable saying all of that, but I don't want to speculate on what I'd be doing because I would be purely guessing without having run anything over there. So now looking individually at the hitting options. So one other thing, I guess, from just an overall hitting standpoint, I've mentioned it on shows before, but especially on a slate of this size, when I look and see that I'm getting the 47% Jace Young and 45% Sweeney and 33% Torkelson, it does make me think that either there was a flaw in something that I did in my process, there's a flaw in ownership, or in the ownership projections, that I used, the way things are being projected right now, or it's just, a weird slate where I have a much different view of, in this case, Detroit than the field. But I do generally like seeing these numbers for hitters closer to like the 30% range, especially on slates of this size where there's just like an infinite number of players that have the same range of outcomes. So that was something that just, kind of tipped me off pretty immediately when I looked that I probably wasn't going to be really thrilled with the exposures that I have for this show. So now going position by position, where I'm sure it's just going to be a lot of White Sox and Tigers mostly. Corey Lee and Jake Rogers at the top. So punting catcher with those two. Clearly, if you are stacking Detroit and stacking the White Sox, you would expect those guys to be showing up. Jake Rogers does have some power upside, which is nice. Corey Lee is batting sixth, so it's not a bad spot in the order for a minimum salary catcher in a decent matchup. So that is nice at least. Obviously, if you're not stacking those teams as much, you're just going to be probably less interested in getting to those guys, but they are still decent values. Danny Jansen for the Red Sox, Alejandro Kirk for Toronto, my next two catchers. Those were also the next two highest stacked teams that I had. So those are the catchers that I'm getting double-digit exposure to. Happy with all of them for, varying reasons. Obviously, I would prefer getting to like Kirk batting cleanup over the other three, but he's also the most popular of the group. So I'm pretty much in line with the field there. And then just mixing in a bunch of other catchers, probably mostly with whatever stack I'm getting to. The field is pretty spread out at catcher as well. You can see that Kirk's the only guy projected for double-digit ownership here. Trevino getting 7%. I'm not really getting to the Yankees, it looks like, or at least getting to Trevino. Rogers, Diaz, Perez, 5 to 6% owned. So nothing really too interesting at catcher to talk about, I don't think. Mostly, I think just getting to whatever stacks. Andrew said any overs that I like today. I sent out my strikeout props for Dub Club and Endgame subs this morning. Some of those lines have moved, but yeah, I send those out every day, or at least every day that I'm betting, to the subscribers over there. I haven't looked at anything since, and not talking bets on this show. First base, moving over there. We know I have a lot of Torkelson. Screen is frozen, which is not helpful, but we had 33% Torkelson. Clearly, if I'm getting to the Tigers, I want to be getting to Torkelson. And in general, he does look fine here. 4K price tag going up against Flexen, who is far from a good pitching option. Torkelson back from the minors, hopefully figured some stuff out. So he's in 33% of my lineups, fields at 9%. Big stand there. 22% Andrew Vaughn. So again, a big stand on him. A big stand on a White Sox hitter going up against Montero. And then very spread out at first base, probably, again, just kind of in line with my stacks. Still, though, one nice thing about, 14-game slates, 5% Tristan Casas, still slightly over the field. Diaz, 5%, pretty much in line with the field. So, again, just kind of can play whatever you want from an ownership standpoint. None of these guys are getting a lot of ownership. Somebody being 5% owned versus 2% owned isn't going to make a big difference as far as how you should be approaching them. The highest owned first baseman for the field is Spencer Horwitz at 9%. I got 1% at first base. I probably have a bit more at second base, or at least I would like to. I do like the matchup for him quite a bit against Kokonowitz. Left-handed bat that does have power, had, I think, like the highest WRC plus among qualified hitters at AAA this year, going up against a pitcher in Kokonowitz, who, if I remember correctly, didn't even pitch at AAA this year or spend much time there. And for sure, I know I'm remembering correctly, does not look like a good major league pitcher. I do really like this spot for Spencer Horwitz, so hopefully I have a bit more at second base. And 18 starts at AA this year for Kokonowitz before they just moved him straight up to the majors, where he has been predictably extremely bad, striking out 7.8% of hitters so far. Most projection models expect him to improve that all the way to like 12 or 13%. 5 to 5.5 projected FIP for him going forward. 6.46 so far this season. The dude's been incredibly bad. So Horwitz, if I get more at second base, I'm happy with that. I certainly think he's a good play. Shohei Ohtani, pretty self-explanatory. Not getting to Diaz or Perez at first base. Field's getting a bit overall, but that includes their catcher exposure as well. So nothing, nobody really standing out for the field at first base either. Not too surprising. And then obviously, like I said, I'm prioritizing Torkelson and Vaughn right now. Even if those numbers do come down a bit, they're probably going to be pretty nice stands versus the field, given that neither guy's projected for much ownership. At second base, Colt Keith leading the way, 3,600, 17% of my lineups. Certainly happy with that. Like the matchup with Flexen. Brooks Baldwin getting a lot. it's just a piece that if I were playing less of the pay-up pitchers, I probably do lose some Baldwin, but he is really cheap. Second base, not the best position. He does give you stolen base upside, which is nice. That is something that I've mentioned. When you are punting a position, you're generally not going to have the opportunity to punt a position punt a position with like power hitters, because why would they be so cheap? But stolen bases can be kind of overlooked in pricing, and Baldwin is somebody that if he does get on base will run. Other than that, pretty flat again at second base. Christopher Morel, Will Wagner, who I do like a lot. I don't know how his salary goes down. He was up to like 2,500 the other day. He's been very popular on pretty much every slate that he's been on. Now he's somehow down to 2,300 in a really good spot with Kokonowitz. So I do like that. I think that if you were playing pitchers that are a little bit lower owned than the ones that I'm getting to, you can probably take on a bit more Will Wagner. I haven't built any cash lineups. This isn't a cash show, but I would assume that $2,300 Will Wagner batting fifth in this spot is probably your cash second baseman on DraftKings. Pretty tough to get away from that, I would think. A little over the field with Massey, a little under the field on Torres. Field is getting to double-digit exposure on Torres going up against the Rockies in New York. High implied run total for the Yankees at home. Kyle Freeland pitching for the Rockies. So clearly going to look like a pretty good spot for Torres at 3,900 leading off. I'm just saving a little bit of ownership there, getting to Keith for $300 less. Wagner and Horwitz both getting ownership, and I think it's warranted for both of them. It is a very good spot. Chris Taylor, the field's getting to him a bit. I don't know. I guess I'm just going to play Brooks Baldwin instead, which isn't the end of the world. Altuve, field's getting to a bit against Baltimore, going up against Cade Povich. Kind of a weird spot for Altuve, but he does give you stolen base upside, which is nice. The reason I say it's a weird spot is that, for one, he is in a park that is difficult for right-handed hitters to hit home runs. And then he's going up against the pitcher in Povich, who actually has pretty good stuff. Isn't somebody that I expect to get hit hard all that often. His biggest issue generally is with walks, and that doesn't mean, that he can't just fall behind 3-1 in a count, groove a fastball, and Altuve crushes it. But combined with the park that they're playing in being very difficult for hitting home runs to left field, and a pitcher that, when he's not at the top of his game, is usually just like walking you. I'm not saying Altuve doesn't have upside. It's just a little bit more difficult path, I think, to that ceiling than it would be in a lot of other situations. So that combined with the salary, I don't hate that I'm not getting as much as the field. But again, 8% ownership, nothing to be overly concerned about. If I were stacking Houston a lot, I would obviously be playing Altuve also. So Colt Keith, the guy standing out for me, and I do really like that. The other guy I'm getting a lot of is Baldwin. I don't like that nearly as much. If you told me I could only play one of Keith or Baldwin at this exposure level, I would absolutely choose Colt Keith. At third base, we had already seen Jace Young, 2,400, just showing up an absurd amount. Third base, one thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't come with quite as much opportunity cost as I think it used to in previous seasons. Like, we've kind of seen that transition over to shortstop, where if you're paying down at shortstop a lot, you on most slates are making big sacrifices, because it means you're not getting to Gunnar or De La Cruz or Witt or Abrams or Seager. You don't really have quite as much of that at third base. So it is a position that I found myself paying down at more recently. You do have Devers in a pretty nice spot. You do have Royce Lewis, who is really good. I'm not saying that there aren't any good third basemen, but it's not as deep a position. It doesn't come with as much opportunity cost as some others. So that is one thing that probably is driving up Jace Young as well. In addition to just, he's a highly regarded prospect. He projects as a, probably average at least hitter already. And he is in a good spot, getting a park upgrade at essentially minimum salary. Devers showing up second most for me. Clearly going to be happy with that, especially at 5% ownership. So I do like that I'm able to find the salary for him. Again, Ryan Nelson, not a bad pitcher, but I'm happy to take my chances with Rafael Devers against Ryan Nelson, a pitcher that doesn't miss a lot of bats in Fenway Park. I like that quite a bit. And then just spreading things out. Caminero, still very cheap for Tampa Bay. Again, a top prospect who just isn't priced like one. Likely to be hitting in the middle of the order for the Rays. Royce Lewis, very good if you can find the salary. The field is getting to Young as their highest owned guy, just not at the same rate that I am. They're getting to Ernie Clement, who I don't have at third base. Maybe I have him at shortstop. Same thing that I've said about the Toronto bats already does apply. I think Clement's a good play at 3,600. He's batting 6th, so he is in a pretty good lineup spot. He's just getting pushed out at third base in large part because of Jace Young. So maybe I have more at short, but also just I'm getting to the Blue Jays. It just doesn't seem like I'm getting to them quite as much as the field. And if I do need to prioritize Blue Jays, if maybe it's a situation where I'm using them as mini stacks, but not as much as 5-man stacks because of ownership, I would rather be getting Horwitz and Wagner before Clement, even though I think that, Clement still looks pretty good in general. Jake said thoughts on Arizona stacks in general. I think that, obviously I'm not getting to them, but I don't have a problem with them. Pretty high implied run total here. Going up against Brian Bayo, who is an okay pitcher. When he's on, he gets ground balls. He's a decent strikeout pitcher with a 22% K percentage, but he has allowed a pretty substantial amount of power this year, 1.38 home runs per 9 innings. So there is a lot of upside just getting to the Diamondbacks in this park. I assume the pricing is probably why I'm not getting to them as much. Not that they're super expensive. They're just, a lot more expensive than Detroit and the White Sox. Corbin Carroll leading off at 5,500 is the only guy on Arizona above 5K on DraftKings. 4,700 for McCarthy, 4,800 for Peterson. Not free, but, not too much of an issue. You do get a solid catcher option as well in Del Castillo, though he is up to 4,500. So I like the park. I like the upside for them. They're just not a team that I'm getting to right now, but definitely they're definitely not a team where, if I saw somebody play them or I saw them win, I would be surprised or think they were a bad play or anything like that. Take a quick look at their ownership. I don't know if maybe that's pushing them down, but yeah, the ownership doesn't seem like anything too crazy. So yeah, I think they're just kind of getting pushed out in part because of the way that I ran my lineups. If I had played more balanced, I'd probably be getting a little bit more just because they do have a very high ceiling, but yeah, no real thoughts there other than I do think that it's a high upside spot. It's not my favorite, matchup against Bayo, but yeah, high upside spot. Just saw James' message about Sean V. That really sucks. Hope that he recovers well. Definitely like having him in chat. So yeah, that really sucks. Really sorry to hear that. Oakland against Savali. Sure. It's not like Savali's great and Oakland does have power upside. The problem is just mostly going to be the park. Difficult to hit home runs in Oakland, and that is amplified a little bit on a slate of this size just because you're going to have so many home runs hit in general. You don't have cores on this slate, but you do have Yankee Stadium, you have Cleveland, you have Boston, you have Toronto, you have Atlanta, you have Kansas City, which isn't great for home runs, but it is good for scoring in general. You have Dodger Stadium. So that's the biggest issue, I think, is that it is tough to hit home runs in that park. And there's just so many good offenses on this slate. But, Oakland does have some power. Savali's not a great pitcher. I'd like it more if Savali were getting a little bit more ownership. Shortstop, I am apparently punting as well a lot. Trey Sweeney and Nicky Lopez. I don't love that as much just for the reason that I was saying earlier. It means that I'm only getting the 7% Bobby Witt Jr. I don't really have Gunnar Henderson. I don't have any of these other stud shortstops really at all. So that's something else that I would like it more if it looked different. Again, I'm confident in my process, and I don't like if I were to get to lock and see that I am still just not really getting to Bobby Witt or anything like that. It's not like I would like manually be jamming him in, but I would be a lot happier talking about this if I were just, getting to Bobby Witt and getting to better players than Trey Sweeney. But that being said, he is really cheap. Nicky Lopez leading off really cheap. Good point per dollar projection. Doesn't have a lot of home run upside. But he is cheap. If you're stacking the White Sox, I think he makes sense. If you're not, I wouldn't really want him a ton as a one-off just because, again, he doesn't come with a lot of upside baked in. He can run a little bit, so there is that. Bobby Witt Jr. obviously looks good. Fields getting to him more than I am. He is projected to be the highest owned shortstop. He probably should be. 6,600, just probably pretty tough to get into lineups with the pitching that I'm getting to. But if you are getting to more Hayden Birdsong lineups, for example. Bobby Witt's your guy. Like, obviously would like to be getting to more of him. Clement not showing up for me really at shortstop either. Already mentioned that, but I do like Toronto here. So certainly wouldn't try and talk anybody off of that. And then finally wrapping things up in the outfield, where I am getting to the White Sox and Tigers. Luis Robert, Riley Green, Matt Vierling, all showing up north of 20%, then Benintendi right at 20%. These guys are at least ones that I'm happy to get to. I would like to get to. Luis Robert, 4,100, stolen base upside, supposedly has power upside, though, we haven't really seen him hit all that well over the last, month or two, but 4,100 is a good price tag for him. Riley Green's a legitimate good hitter, good player in a good spot. I like getting to him at sub 10% ownership. Matt Vierling's very cheap, assuming he's hitting at the top of the order. Benintendi, not the best power hitter outside of the last 2 weeks. He suddenly figured out how to hit home runs. But he's cheap. If you're stacking the White Sox, he looks good. If you're not, he's not the most appealing one-off. But is obviously a good point per dollar play. Parker Meadows gives you some stolen base upside in addition to being a decent hitter at 3,400. So I do at least like the outfielders from these teams. Certainly happier to be, seeing these names than seeing like a bunch of Trey Sweeney, for example. George Springer, getting to him a little bit more than the field against Kokonowitz. Happy with that. Same with Dalton Varsho. Kerry Carpenter, another outfielder that looks good from the Tigers. Aaron Judge, don't need me to tell you that he hits a lot of home runs. Vierling projected to be the highest owned outfielder. I'm over the field there. I'm pretty much in line with Judge and Springer. So I am getting to the outfielders that the field's getting to more so than some other positions. Corbin Carroll, I'm a little below, but nothing too crazy there. Shai said, do you change your lineup settings or just go with what SaberSim suggests? I assume you mean like for the build settings. I use generally what SaberSim recommends. They've done a lot more back testing on that than I have. I do a lot of stuff outside of SaberSim as far as figuring out what lineups I'm going to play and all of that. And I've talked through all of that in the videos that I put out at Endgame Syndicate. Link for that site is in the description below. If you're not familiar, Uticow, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, and myself putting together a site, instructional videos, training videos, Discord, with access to us, just talking strategy, talking about ways to get better, improve whatever your process is. We all approach DFS differently. We all have different strengths. So no matter sort of what your knowledge base is, what your approach is, there's somebody there that's going to be able to help you out and probably give you some ideas, improve your game, all of that. But like I was saying, I've walked through a lot of stuff that I do outside of SaberSim in videos over there. But as far as the actual lineup building, I use the recommended settings because they've tested them out. They, do what I want them to do. I don't generally look and notice that like they're giving me shitty lineups or anything like that. So I do use those. So yeah, that wraps this one up. If nobody has any last minute videos, like I said, kind of wish that my exposures looked a little bit flatter, both for the sake of just having more players to talk about in the video, but also because the lineups that I enter, I would like to be flatter, just because I am getting a lot of overlap with the White Sox and Tigers, really. But I do think the Tigers look like good value plays. I do think that you're getting quality lineups with them. If we look at what some of the Detroit stacks look like. So here we have a 5-man Detroit stack where, you're getting solid hitters from Detroit, but then you're getting the Kirk Horwitz 2-man from Toronto in a good spot. You're getting a Corbin Carroll 1-off with Castillo and Rodon. That lineup's going to look really good, and the ownership just isn't really going to be problematic on this slate. If we scroll down a little bit, Detroit 5-man with Aaron Judge, Sanchez, Morel, paying all the way up for sale and still getting to Rodon. So it's just that it's opening the door for so many good lineups. Here we have the 2-man with Lee and Robert, Bobby Witt 1-off, and 2 of the best pitchers on the slate. You're getting really, really good projected lineups, and the ownership isn't going to be high enough to push you off of them. So I do think that, they're a good stack. I do think I'll be getting to them a lot. I just probably won't end up playing them quite as much, and it'll push up some of these other stacks. JP Sears, ? I mean, I don't really have a lot of need for him on this slate. It's not like it's a great matchup against Milwaukee. He's not a great pitcher. He's somebody that I would have more interest in on smaller slates. He's projected for like 3 to 4% ownership. I would have none if the slate started right now. 8,300 is not a great price tag either. Like, I have a really hard time trying to make an argument for Sears outside of just it's baseball, random shit happens, and he's low owned. But on a 14-game slate, you can still find low-owned guys that are better and in a more likely situation to have good random shit happen. So tough for me to make a good argument for Sears. But yeah, that's all I have for this one. Thanks for checking out the show. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, all of that. I'll be back here on Monday doing the same show. Have a good weekend. Hit me up in Discord if you are an Endgame member or a Dub Club member. Other than that, good luck on your lineups tonight. Enjoy your weekend.